This is the IDP After Show.
Hello and welcome to the IDP After Show. I am your host, Jeff Pomazal. Best ball leagues are becoming very popular in the world of fantasy sports. There are many different views and takes on how to build a championship roster. So in this episode of the IDP After Show, I'm joined by none other than David Kelly, who took an analytical approach to 71 best ball drafts from last season, and he's here to tell us what he discovered. David, thank you for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jeff.
So, for someone who hasn't had the pleasure of reading your article yet, which we'll have the link in the comments down below, what inspired you to write this article in the first place?
So, just in terms of like the other content or articles I read or podcasts I consume for fantasy football, on the offensive side, with the popularity of best ball there's a great wealth of knowledge and research that gets done on those best ball tournaments because you have things like Underdog's Best Ball Mania that has 400,000 or 500,000 teams in one tournament, so people can download that data set, do whatever analysis that they have on it, and come up with the best conclusions on roster construction, on draft strategy. But in IDP, we don't really get the chance to do that. Most of the time, ADP is really, really bad to the point of it being unusable. But with our friends at the IDP Show, the Kentucky Boys, starting doing best ball drafts in 2022, that gave us the opportunity to at least do something. So last year there was 6 leagues that they had done a full draft on. So that was the best ball simulation article that I did, that I think was really well received, except for the one person who called me a coward. But then this last year in 2023, because they ran 71 leagues, that gave us enough that we didn't really have to do a full simulation. We didn't have to make a whole bunch of assumptions on like how to assign the randomness based on the ADP that we had. So for this year, I just looked at the 71 leagues, input all the team scores and final rankings, and then just start filtering by, here's all the teams that were in first place, here are all the teams that were top 3, and then starting to look for like what was more common amongst winners or third place teams than all the other teams in terms of how they started drafts, when they started addressing different positions.
So obviously that was a very time consuming exercise, right? Like how much time do you feel that you put into kind of synthesizing all that data into something usable for your article?
I think last year's article took me about 8 weeks to figure out, but a lot of that was trying to figure out things in Microsoft Excel that I don't know how to do. Like I needed macros to basically go and score every team, so I wasn't going through and going, okay, team 1, and have it populate all the scores and then copy that back. Like I needed something for the computer to do that for me. This year, a little bit simpler, that really once I just had all the teams inputted, just the filter function really quickly sorts through teams however you want, by player, by draft slot, by the person who drafted that team. So this year was a lot easier, and that's why the articles are a lot quicker.
For someone who likes data like I do, like looking through the data in the spreadsheets, it's a phenomenal resource and tool. So as you were going through it, David, was there anything that was interesting to you that stood out, maybe even like a little shocking, as far as teams that rose to the top, or maybe teams that kind of consistently kind of fell to the wayside?
Yeah, I think there were 3 main takeaways from the article this year, and some of them were takeaways that were in the article last year. The first one was on drafting defensive backs. So last year, the article looked at how many defensive backs teams drafted within the first 10 rounds of their draft. I picked 10 rounds because that's about when the 24th defensive back came off the board. So you could kind of see like if you drafted 0, if you drafted 2, that was kind of right in line with where the rest of the draft was. You were kind of drafting that position pretty much equally with everybody else. If you drafted 1 or 0, you were fading the position. If you drafted more than 2, then you were prioritizing it. And last year, drafting defensive back early showed to be really, really bad. So this year, I looked at that again. The ADP for defensive back slid a little bit, whether from people reading the first article or just doing it on their own. So the 24th defensive back was drafted in round 13 this time. So I know last year I had a couple of discussions with Evan Ronda on like, Derwin James the first year was or 2 years ago was a second round pick. Last year he was a third round pick. Sometimes he would slide to the fourth. So maybe there was going to be a breaking point where as defensive backs slide back, they start becoming good picks. But when we went through the teams this year, we found that people who drafted defensive backs in the first 13 rounds still did really bad. The best thing to do for that was to just not draft any at all and draft all your defensive backs at the end. Unless, of course, you were Country Boy Swagger, who drafted 4 in the first 8 rounds and then won IDP Madness. I mean, he had an excellent team, and I think you guys talked about that 2 months ago when you had him on. Like, he drafts, I think, if memory serves, like 2 of the top 10 defensive backs. He gets 2 of the top 5 linebackers in early rounds. He gets really good up and coming defensive linemen in the 20 rounds plus, like Mafe, and I think he had Jermaine Johnson late on that team. So a team that's going to pick all the right players is going to win regardless. But this article is trying to sort out like what on balance in a broad number of drafts is going to be more profitable more often than not. So anyway, defensive back was kind of the first takeaway. The second thing that I looked at again was how people started their drafts with respect to defensive line first or linebacker first. That's always a common topic you see on podcasts or in articles or whatever. Like, what would people prefer to start their drafts with, defensive linemen or linebackers? There's lots of people on both sides of that. There's a lot of people who like linebackers early because they like consistency on their teams. I don't know if I believe in the consistency thing as much as everybody else, but in best ball, it really shouldn't matter to you at all because you're not setting a lineup. The computer is making your teams for you. And the data that we had from last year, even though we have drafts where there's a lot of defensive linemen picked at the very top of drafts, that starts that had defensive linemen early were better drafts. So teams that had 3 defensive linemen in the first 3 picks, they had a win rate of like almost 14%. The average win rate would be about 8%. So that's almost double. Like, it's a very strong start. And when once we looked at the first 6 rounds, you still saw that, heavy defensive lineman starts were better off both for winning or for finishing third. And that started to tail off as you started picking more linebackers. The third thing that we looked at, which was new this year, was looking at teams in terms of the players that they picked versus ADP and which teams were getting sort of like the most value from their team. And that was something that was inspired by Michael Leone's Best Ball Manifesto that he wrote last year for Establish the Run that was meant for Best Ball Mania. What he found in his article was that teams that got lots of ADP value had very high advance rates in Best Ball Mania, but it wasn't as strong of a correlation for playoff weeks. But at least for our leagues of the structure that they are of a season-long total points league, we're kind of more interested in strategies that would be high advance rate strategies anyway, because that's, pretty similar in a best ball tournament. The first 14 weeks is that first round. Here we're looking at the first 18 because sleeper will score the whole season, doesn't stop at 17 weeks. And what we found with that, what I did is I basically sorted all the teams in buckets in terms of like the top, each sort of 20th percentile band of ADP value that a team got. And what we found with that was that the bucket that had the teams with the most ADP value absolutely crushed. They had a win rate around 15%. They had a third place rate of 40%, extraordinarily high. But if you weren't in that bucket, the next 2 buckets were also quite good too. You didn't see a fall off. You didn't see a really strong fall off in either win rate or third place rate until you got to the bottom 2 buckets, with the bottom bucket ended up having like a 2% win rate. So the teams that really reached on players in their drafts generally got crushed.
And it's interesting that there's such a correlation between best ball and regular IDP defensive leagues too. You see your teams that are perennial at the top have a very strong defensive line. They probably then have a very solid linebacking core, and they always punt or wait to draft defensive backs. And it kind of sounds like best ball, at least through your research and data, kind of piggybacks on that. Like, you can always wait on defensive backs through in your draft. So kind of an interesting correlation there. Is there anything that, like we had the outlier with Country Boy Swagger, who kind of broke the mold about not drafting defensive backs early?
He did draft defensive backs
He
early.
did. I know. Yes, he did draft. He kind of broke the mold. Like, he was the one that drafted defensive backs early and ended up winning it. were there other teams that had similar success as Country Boy Swagger, or was it very much like he was like the outlier team that did that and he just nailed every single pick? Like you mentioned, he drafted Mafe and Jermaine Johnson super late, hit on both of those. And like you said, if you draft the right players, you're going to win regardless. You can't help it but win. But is he like the anomaly in all of this, where like he was just like the super outlier of the only team that did that, and that most of the teams that they did that approach with the 4 or 5 defensive linemen in the first 6 rounds?
If memory serves, he was the only one who had 4 in the first 13 rounds who ended up winning their individual league. There was a handful of other people, like 2 or 3, who had 3 defensive backs within that range that won their league. But so there are some. The other one that I remember from last year was that Matt Record at IDP Plus was in one of the best balls, and I forget the construction of his team now, but he had a whole bunch of defensive backs early, and then the back end of his draft was like Javon Hargrave. No, was it Hargrave? He had a bunch of Eagles defensive linemen that went really late, including the tackles, and that was the year where the Eagles were like had one of the highest sack totals of any team in NFL history. So you can definitely win with those teams, and it's something that, like, if you're only going to draft one best ball team the whole season, just draft whatever players you want. But if you're going to do more drafts than that and you're trying to give yourself the best chance broadly across all your teams, I think you're better off trying to follow at least generally these kind of structures that get proposed in the article.
Totally agree. Totally agree. Was there any, and this is kind of going off script here a little bit, David, so I'm sorry, apologizing for putting you on the spot here. Was there anything with draft position as far as anything in your research, or no?
I didn't look at that specifically, or if I did, I don't remember. I would
Sure.
guess early draft picks probably did better just because the players that you had in that group all did really well. Like all the early defensive linemen last year, Garrett, Parsons, Watt, Crosby, Nick Bosa, not so much because he had a slow start. I think what did he have? He had the contract holdout last year.
Hmm. Yep.
So those guys were all really strong, and some of the guys at the back half, like Jalen Phillips gets hurt,
Kayvon
Nick Bolton
Thibodeau.
gets hurt, Kayvon Thibodeau was okay though, wasn't he? He had 10 sacks last year.
Yeah, but it was so streaky. It was all like in one week. He had like a couple of really strong weeks. The only reason I know that is because I always ended up drafting at the end of like the turn, the 11 or 12th pick, and then I was always getting like having to choose between Thibodeau or Jalen Johnson, and that's how I never got to pick one of those elite defensive linemen. So that was the only reason I was in that wheelhouse of that 12-13 turn.
Yeah, Kayvon Thibodeau finished with like a 5% win rate. So there was 4 teams that had him that won their league. But his third place rate was okay. It was 30%. So you had teams who picked him who had high finishes, and whether it was just luck that they didn't finish first in their league
Sure.
or whatnot, then
Well, we're not here to discuss my best ball downfall, so I'll save that for a later episode or maybe therapy session with you. So kind of thinking about that last year's information, last year's data, how can someone going into this year's best ball use that approach? So how can they replicate that consistency regardless of ADP or regardless of draft position? Defensive line first and heavy, is that what we're hearing?
yeah, I think so. I mean, I think overall you have to kind of manage those 3 takeaways as best you can during drafts because you'll just have things in draft rooms that will come into conflict with that. Like for example, um, the top safeties this year are all kind of settling out as like round 5, round 6 picks. Well, what if one of them falls to round 7? I had Derwin James fall to me at 7-12 in Best Ball 1. Now, granted, in Best Ball 1, we hadn't seen what the ADP was going to shake out like for this year, but you know, I took him there, and then you have to try and make up later. But I'm getting ADP value on Derwin James, or at least I hope I'm going to get ADP value on Derwin James, trading off for drafting a defensive back early where I could be drafting a different position. So some of those things, and then I think being like really mindful of your choices. So the data is suggesting take a bunch of defensive linemen early, but what do you do if you're in a first round of a draft picking late and it's been a giant run of defensive linemen and no one's really touched linebacker. Um, that happened to me in, I think, Best Ball 7, where Roquan Smith fell back to me at the 2-5. I ended up taking Khalil Mack instead of him. But there's at least like an interesting trade-off there of like, you could take someone that's sort of out of the optimal structure for drafting defensive linemen. Um, the trick with that is making sure that you catch up on that. And the thing that I looked at a couple weeks before we did this podcast, so this is new and it's not in the article, is I looked at the top 12 players by ADP last year, and then I, filtered those teams and looked at the general team structures of how those teams ended out, who picked those specific players. And all the top 12 were pretty similar, except for the teams where players drafted Foye Oluokun and Nick Bolton. Those two teams, the teams in general that drafted those two players, drafted an extra linebacker through 6 rounds than all the other teams did. So it's almost as if the people who were selecting those players at that spot, not only thought that those were the best players for their spot, but also were making a conscious choice to draft a whole bunch of linebackers. So it's not like they're necessarily bad picks there, but if you are going to spend an early round pick on a linebacker just because there's been such a big run of defensive linemen, it's wise to make that up at some point. And then the other thing I was just going to touch on here is just kind of be mindful and look at the ADP and just look at like what's going to be available at each stage of the draft. One of the things that I like is Sean Siegel from RotoViz talks about looking at your drafts from the end of the draft forward in terms of like what is going to be available in each spot. So, at the end of these IDP best balls, it's mostly going to be defensive backs that are there for you because defensive line and linebacker has been pretty picked over. Linebacker, if you look at that position, you've got a fairly broad group of guys that, to varying levels of confidence, we are sure that they're going to be 3 down players all year. And once you start getting, maybe linebacker 40, linebacker 50, those guys start to fall off and you start to get injury replacement guys. You start to get younger players that you're hoping are ascending. And then after that, you're just taking shots. Defensive line, you get really elite players in the first 3 rounds, and then those start to go away. You start to get, rotational guys, which are fine for best ball because you're hunting for those spike weeks. But then after that, you're getting into players that, we know they're bad, or maybe they're nose tackles that don't get good deployment for the purposes of fantasy football based on their alignment or whatever. So just being mindful of, you know, not just looking at your draft top down of like, I can take a bunch of linebackers early, but if you do that, like, how are you going to fill out those other positions? Are you going to lose out because you're going to get out of specific windows for specific groups of players?
It's interesting too that you mentioned like Foye Oluokun and Nick Bolton, because I remember vividly like last year the top 4 or 5 defensive linemen would go off the board, and if you were sitting like at that 6, 7, 8 pick, were you either going to reach for one of those end of the first round defensive linemen like a Jalen Johnson or a Kayvon Thibodeau, or were you going to settle for that consistent linebacker like Foye Oluokun? So, just kind of like where you sit in the draft too might have some flux in that too. So just kind of interesting takeaway there too.
Yeah, I remember having tough choices in some of those drafts too. Like I had one late best ball picking 7th or 8th, I don't remember. And that sort of group of 5 must have been 7th because that group of 5 defensive linemen was off the board and Roquan Smith was gone. So you are looking at, Bolton or Foye, or you're looking at that group of defensive linemen that was at the back: Burns, Thibodeau, Hutchinson, Reddick, Phillips. Well, I had 2 drafts earlier that I had started Phillips and Reddick, so I didn't want to go to that yet again. I felt uncomfortable with Brian Burns and Thibodeau being that early. Probably Hutchinson too, because I was a little bit leery of, second year players that didn't have like amazing PFF peripherals being first round best ball picks. Now, Hutchinson ends up crushing it anyway, and he's a first round pick again. But yeah, you end up getting with some tough choices in there that are maybe outside of what like an optimal structure would be. So you can't just read the article, write down what the optimal structure is, and then draft very strictly for that too, because then I think you start falling into problems where, you start reaching for players and you don't get the ADP value, which we also show is really useful for your teams.
Well, speaking of ADP, this is a perfect segue into the next piece here too, David. So, as comparing last year's data to this year's data so far, are there players you're finding that are going a little bit later this year in drafts than they were last season that's possibly making them a little bit of a value from last year to this year?
Yeah, there's a couple now. Granted, some of these ones I didn't write down weren't necessarily fallers from last year, but this first one is. So Chase Young is going right now at a draft position of 122. He's defensive line 64. And I really think the problem with Chase Young is that people are tired of him. He's always been drafted high since he's come into the league. He was defensive line 26 in last year's best ball drafts, and he had a good start with Washington and then fell off with San Francisco. He didn't have very many strong weeks there towards the end of the season, but it's still a player that had like a 15% pressure rate last year, who still played a high percentage of snaps. And where you're getting him now is totally fine. Like you can take him there, and if you luck into a role where he gets a bunch of snaps and you luck into some more sacks, I think all of his peripherals are strong enough that he doesn't have to be the 64th defensive lineman off the boards. Now, he ended up having like a horrible, horrible landing spot because both Carl Granderson and Cameron Jordan played a lot for New Orleans last year, so it is hard to do that projection of go, okay, how do all these guys get 65% of snaps? Like that's really tight to sort of lump all those guys in there. And I think Granderson played more than that anyway. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, like Polo has the exact same problem with the Chargers with Khalil Mack and Joey Bosa in front of him, and he's a round 7 pick instead. He's went 4 rounds ahead of Chase Young. So I I like this, and this is really the first year that you can get him that cheap. Like in addition to the ADP stuff that we have for these best ball leagues, I went back this afternoon and went through the ADP for the invitational that IDP Plus runs. And ever since Chase Young came into the league, he was DL4 in their drafts as a rookie. He was a top 10 defensive lineman next year. He was 11th the following year. He was somewhere in the 20s last year because, he had that slow season the year before coming back from injury. But this is really the first year where his draft position's really, really fallen off. So in past years, I haven't been in on Chase Young and redraft, but this year I'm in on Chase Young and redraft.
Yeah, especially at that value, I don't see a problem at all taking that. It's so interesting too when we look at player situations from 22 to 23 and now looking at their situations here in 24, how much of an impact that has on, like you mentioned, snap count, situational role, that kind of stuff. So Chase Young going in the mid seventh now is much safer than when he was going, you know, third, fourth round last year. So you're getting much better at discount.
But that was Tuli Tulopu that was going in the
Oh,
seventh.
is it?
Chase Young's an 11th round pick this year.
Oh, so even more
So
value. So, and Tulopo is kind of an interesting one too, just because he was playing so much for the, like Joey Bosa was injured, or Nick Bosa, Joey Bosa was injured, and so he probably got a lot more snaps. So I'm sure his value is a little inflated this year versus, previously as a rookie, he probably wasn't even drafted very much, I would guess. So,
yeah, and I mean, I still like him too. He played pretty well last year, and his peripherals are all really strong. So I don't really see a problem with him either where he's going. But I mean, he has snap count risk as well. But really, anyone who's getting drafted around Chase Young, you're looking at like situational rushers. You're looking at second year players who may or may not have played particularly well as rookies. So he's in kind of a nice spot where the people you're picking him over are just not the same as the people you picked him over the last 3 years.
right. And I think you nailed it too. At that point in the draft, you're not looking for your consistent every week defensive lineman, one, two, or three. You're looking for those guys that have those spike weeks. You're looking for like, because the computer will generate your roster based on the top scoring at each position. So you only need him to score well 4 or 5 weeks, and he's already returning value at where you're getting him. It's not like you're taking him super early where you need him to score 12 times for your lineup. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the players I found was interesting looking through your data was Cameron Hayward. Last year he was drafted as D-line 27, right around ADP 50. This year he's going at D-line 79, almost 142nd player taken off the board, which was kind of interesting. I don't think anything has drastically changed for Cameron Hayward. Yeah, he's a year older, but he's a pretty savvy veteran. That defensive line is still pretty elite. with Highsmith on one side, you got TJ Watt on the other side. Hopefully both of those guys stay healthy. It makes his job a little easier. I know that they've got Herbig there also, but so I can't see him losing that many snaps to those guys. I think that's tremendous value for a player like Cameron Hayward's status. And I know he plays on the interior, but he's still good for a couple spike weeks. And especially if you're getting him in the 140s, I feel tremendous value. So
Yeah, and he got hurt last year, right? So maybe it's just some of out of sight, out of mind because he didn't play a whole
recency
lot.
bias, yeah.
Um, I mean, I guess you would have some age risk with him, but again, you're getting him so late that I think that's worth the risk at that point.
That's a free lotto ticket right there. Who
Mhm.
else do you have, David, as a player who is maybe going a little bit later than last year or in 2023, who's kind of you see as a value?
Yeah, so one guy I like is Rashawn Gary, and he's going at ADP 31. He's a 21st defensive lineman. I think some of this is that his season long totals look really bad because I can't remember the injury, if it was ACL or Achilles, but he had one of those season-ending injuries about November 2022. He made it back for week one of this year, and he was playing 20% of snaps, 25% of snaps, 30% of snaps. It took him a while to ramp up to a full snap share towards the end of the season. He got to about 70% of snaps, which is what he had done the previous 2 years. But he finishes with 15% pressure rate, which is quite good. The previous 2 years, he is 18% and 17%. That's near elite numbers in that metric. Last year, he finishes 12th in PFF win rate for people who've played 50% of snaps or more. 2 years ago, he was third, and he's not that old. He turns 27 in December. So I think really, if you look at the body of work over the past 2 seasons, you have to just excuse the little bit of playing time issues that he has early last year just because he's coming back from that injury. Um, he's not really not too dissimilar to Matthew Judon, who is a second round pick and is 5 years older than him. So I really think Rashawn Gary is an easy click in the third round. Like he really should be a second round pick in these leagues.
I know that Rashawn Gary signed an in-season contract last year, and as soon as he signed his contract, he kind of slowed down. So a lot of Packer fans were giving him grief about those money bags were holding him back. So hopefully he's kind of made a deposit in the bank so he can start ramping it back up like he was. Because for a while there, he was on a tear from after he kind of came back, got his legs back under him about week 4 through about week 9, 10, and then he was just on a tear there. So hopefully he can return to that not only for best ball but for the Packers as well. So
Or it could be a small sample, or it could be a conditioning thing. I totally forgot that you're in Wisconsin when I was writing these notes, and you were just going to know more about this player than I was.
Kyle Bellafuel and I, we kind of go back and forth quite a bit on Packer players, so that's kind of our daily thing. So we're we're the green and gold. So if anybody needs any commentary, we're your guys. So one player I had is again looking through your data was a linebacker, Jordan Hicks. Last year he was linebacker 30. He was going off the board right around pick 84. This year he's linebacker 51, going off about 136. And I feel this is a player who's probably in a better situation now than he was last year. Yeah, he moved to another team. He's a year older. He is a vet, but he's one of those like very savvy vets. He's Mike Wohlert kind of expected him to wear the green dot this year for the Browns. I feel he's a player that's going to return value. He had an injury last season that sidelined him, and then we got to see Ivan Pace kind of take run. But he was a player that when he came back, he pushed Ivan Pace to the side and finished out the season very, very strong for the Vikings. Now he goes to a team where he's probably going to be the LB1 for sure next to JOK. And I think he at his suppressed value, it's an even better return at linebacker 51, ADP 136 right now. So
Yeah, I will just say this up front that I'm a little bit scheme ignorant on some of these teams, but Jordan Hicks rushed the passer quite a bit last year. So if he has that same kind of role in Cleveland, and I'm not saying that he is, but if they do use him in that kind of way, that's a little bit more of the archetype of linebacker that we want in these leagues because the scoring is so big play heavy.
well, that would be a Mike Woolard question. So we'll have to put an asterisk by that one. So I've got one more player I was really impressed with, or not impressed with, but just surprised more so. just because the situation seemed to improve more so than not. That's Josie Jewell. Last year he was being drafted as linebacker 19, right around pick 57. So you're getting him right around the end of the 5th round. This year he is now playing for the Commanders. He's going off the board at linebacker 38, right about pick 98. So again, a player who probably landed in a push at worst, maybe in a better situation, but now he's going off the board almost 20 picks or 20 roster spots later. So Josie Jewell is just another one of those players I think maybe just put a little check mark by and kind of see where he is at your draft when you're picking, because that just seems like a good value for a player that's going to just absorb a bunch of tackles for the Commanders.
Yeah, wait, Commanders or Panthers?
Panthers, sorry. Yes, he went
Yeah,
from Denver to yes.
yeah. The Panthers are kind of a nice spot for him because that's the Evero defense that, at least in some of the stuff that Macri did a couple of years ago, projects really high as a defense that's linebacker friendly for tackles. And you've got a team there where, like, I like Shaq Thompson too, but he's coming back from a pretty big injury, so who knows? But Jewel very easily could be the lead linebacker here in a very linebacker friendly defense.
Yeah, and a little side note too. I know that Jules, defensive coordinator, coached him as a linebacker coach in Denver, so there's continuity and familiarity there with him there too. So like year one, he's probably going to be a great stash and play because he knows the system, he knows the language and things like that. So he's probably going to get a lot of run. Pretty long leash, I think. So,
Mm-hmm.
do you have any other players that are kind of like surprisingly going later this year than last, in your
Yeah,
opinion?
I had one more that I wanted to talk about, and that's Dan Henley. And right now, and I think this probably changes, but even in the prep of this, I went and looked at the drafts that are in progress and therefore not in the ADP sheet yet. And this one hasn't really moved. So right now he's an ADP of 134. He's linebacker 50. And I think he probably got the best reasonable outcome for him in free agency with Denzel Perryman coming over to the Chargers and no one else. My lazy defensive coordinator projection for the Chargers is that Jesse Minter is going to run something kind of similar to what we've seen in Baltimore, because there's a lot of, like, Baltimore got their defensive coordinator from Michigan the previous year. Like, there's a lot of similarities with those two teams, and Baltimore ran two linebackers the majority of the time. So, there's still risk here with Henley that either they draft somebody, which I would only really be worried if it was like a second round pick linebacker. They're picking too high in the first round that it would be reasonable for that to be a linebacker. And third round linebackers, if they have a pick in that range, um, almost never do anything as rookies. So he would have a little bit of risk there. And I guess he would have a downside risk that he isn't actually any good at linebacker because we haven't really seen him play in the NFL yet. But LB50 is like totally fine for those risks. If you look at some of his peers of like rookies from last year who were in that third round range, Drew Sanders is going at 110 at LB42, and he's a guy that we've seen all these media reports that he might be shifting to defensive line. Well, that's going to be a little bit harder for him to have a learning curve on than if he had stayed at linebacker. Trenton Simpson, who's in probably a worse situation still to Henley because his linebacker partner is still Roquan Smith, and I don't think Simpson has a realistic chance to play over Smith, but Henley might have a chance to play over Simpson. Perryman. Trent Simpson is LB29 right now, so there's a really big disparity for whatever reason on Henley, and I think this does rise, but at least for now, he's too low in drafts.
Yeah, it's interesting with Simpson because I wonder if drafters are thinking, well, he's just going to kind of play that Patrick Queen role, and we saw both last season that Roquan Smith and Patrick Queen were both viable linebacker options. Simpson comes in and plays that. But like you said with Dan Henley in San Diego or in Las Vegas or San Diego, no, or are they Los Angeles again?
Did I say San Diego?
Yeah, I don't know. In my head, they're always going to be the Chargers. They're always going to be the San Diego Chargers to me. But when they lose, they released Eric Kendricks.
Hendricks.
Yeah, and then they also let Kenneth Murray go too. So that linebacker room is wide open. And to bring in Denzel Perryman, who kind of was hobbled last season, and again as an aging player, Henley at that range makes a great. He's going right around Jordan Hicks. In the one LB50 range. So I would definitely take a flyer on a player like that.
Yeah, like Perryman's a professional linebacker. Like we're not disparaging Denzel Perryman, but there are so many worse outcomes that he could have had
Oh,
there. Like, what if it was Bobby Wagner? Like, there are so many other guys in free agency this year that like would just so clearly have been playing over Henley. Or they
yes.
could have drafted two guys. Like you could have had what Washington did, where they signed Louvu and Wagner, and now Jamin Davis. See you later.
Yep.
Kaliki Hudson. See you later.
Yes. Yeah. Definitely for sure. There's worse people to take there.
And
So,
speaking of Jamin Davis, he's still going ahead of Henley. So the guys that are going ahead of Henley right now, Pete Werner, Drew Tranquil, Jamin Davis, Divine Diablo, Leo Chanel, like there are a lot of questions there on playing time with some of those guys, but I don't think there's as many questions with Henley.
much fewer anyway.
Mhm.
So let's flip it to the other side of the coin now. So we talked about players who are going later than they were last year, and they might provide some really good value. Who are some players whose situation has changed for the time being and are going maybe a great deal earlier than they were at this time last year?
So one guy who's still going too high that I don't like is Kayvon Thibodeau, and he's at ADP of 13. He's the 10th defensive lineman off the board. And I just don't think that he's done enough, at least on like the peripheral side, that you can project him to be that high. So he has a 10% pressure rate as a rookie. He has an 8% pressure rate last year. Most of the guys that you're seeing drafted in the first and second round are 15% or higher pressure rate players. If you go look at PFF win rate for players who played 50% of snaps or more, he's 56 of 58 edges last year. He is 44th out of 58 for pass rush grade. So aside from him having a lot of sacks last year, this just isn't a profile for me of someone who should be an early second round pick.
Is he still going ahead of Brian Burns in drafts, or has that self corrected?
He is still going ahead of Brian Burns in drafts.
Which seems not right.
So yeah, the ADP in that range is Josh Allen 9, Foye Lucan 9.3, Donnell Hunter, Will Anderson, Thibodeau, Fred Warner, Brian Burns, Khalil Mack.
Okay.
Reddick a little bit further back, Trey Hendrickson a little bit further back. Like guys who've had like several consistent years of both good production and good like peripheral stats, whether it's the win rate or pressure rate or whatever.
And it'll be interesting to see, like, as the season goes on and we get more data, if that kind of like corrects or if that just kind of stays the course. Because it seems to me that Brian Burns is going to definitely be the better player there for the Giants defensive lineman, and maybe that creates a situation where Thibodeau doesn't have the pressure on him and he can step up and actually have a good season. But if I in a draft, if I'm at the end of the round one and I'm looking at both of those players, I'm going to probably take Brian Burns 98 times out of 100 just to for consistency as a player.
Yeah, I could easily see that switching with like pictures of Brian Burns and pads at camp looking great, or like this is not the first time that someone's gone on a podcast this fall or this winter and told people to get rid of Thibodeau or don't draft him. So I think you might see more momentum build in that as the offseason goes on.
Well, let me get in a few more best balls before people start really listening and watching, so I can get Brian Burns discount. So,
Mhm.
one player I had noticed that was going really high over last year, and this is obviously a result of having a fantastic rookie season. No one saw this guy coming out, but Kobe Turner last season was D line 167. He was almost undraftable at 153. This year he's going at D line 56, 102 overall ADP, and he had a phenomenal season. And not taking anything away from it, but I just am curious how much of the Aaron Donald effect caused him to have such a great season. Obviously, Aaron Donald has moved on and retired, and so now Kobe Turner is there. And I don't know how you replace a player of Aaron Donald's caliber, a player who was consistently double or triple teamed at times. Obviously making it much easier for players like Kobe Turner to step up. So obviously Turner is going to be a great player. He's going to be drafted, and as he should. I just don't know if 102 is a little advantageous at this point, with everything considering how much that defensive line room has changed from last year to this year.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add with him. I mean, we've seen a couple guys come into Los Angeles, play with Aaron Donald, and then move on elsewhere and not be quite as good, at least in counting stats. So yeah, I don't know what to make of Kobe Turner either.
Do you have another player that you're looking at, maybe like fading a little bit? That's maybe going a little too early this year than last.
I have a group, and this is my last one, and that is any linebacker who's going in the first two rounds right now. So Roquan Smith, Foye Oluokun, Fred Warner, Nick Bolton, Bobby Okereke, and Ernest Jones. Um, it is just very hard to pick linebacker this high. I mean, granted, if some of these fall well past ADP, like that's totally fine. But one of the things that we saw last year is that Foye Oluokun was the second overall drafted linebacker, or maybe third, but he was the highest scoring linebacker and he still has a negative win rate in his best balls. So it's kind of like a what do you win if you win type thing with these guys that, none of them are really driving you to winning performances. Where you started to see, like even going back to 2022, there's just very few people who are drafted at that position in the first couple of rounds who have been excellent picks. Once you get into the third round, you start getting a few more guys who do that. Like Bobby Okereke was a 15% win rate player last year in the third round. But it's just very tough in these first couple rounds, especially when there's so many elite defensive linemen in that range that are then gone after that.
So he almost has to hit his ceiling to make his draft pick worth being drafted at wherever he's at this year, 8 or 9, somewhere in there. Like he almost has to hit that ceiling just to return value. Whereas you're probably better off, turning to a different position, defensive line, and trying to hit gold there.
Yeah, you almost need like a number one overall finish, but not even that. Like you need something that was outscoring top finishers from previous years.
Hmm. Interesting. Well, David, this is fantastic stuff. Thank you so much for enlightening me. I've learned a great deal about best ball. I'm gonna go make sure I go sign up right now for a couple of best balls tonight, and we'll apply these strategies. What are you working on right now, and where can some of the listeners find some more of your work or you in general?
So aside from this, I'm still pretending to be retired, so I'm working on nothing. I plan on doing more drafts. I plan on getting into some more underdog stuff. I got to carve out some time because I've got 2 weeks left to get into the underdog playoff hockey tournament that's drafting right now. So you probably won't see an awful lot of me until next year unless somebody else has me on to talk about best ball. There's one person I've talked to about doing a show with them maybe after the NFL draft.
Well, fantastic. Well, be sure that you go out onto Twitter. Be sure you go out onto the IDPshow.com and get yourself into one of these many IDP best ball drafts that are going on right now. David, how many are already drafted, completed already this season?
I think they've got 8 in the dock, 7 in the dock. Um, I think they have up to 13 and like 13 completed or in progress right now.
Okay.
They had
And
that
so,
batch in the email the other day, and I know there's a couple that still need people in them, but I don't know the numbers off the top of my head.
so there's always a draft to be found. So make sure you go on Twitter, go to the IDPshow.com. There's definitely going to be an IDP draft available and ready to go. And, various levels of entry fees. So whatever you're interested in, there's definitely something for everyone.
Yeah,
So,
just go to the idpshow.com because Twitter sucks.
okay. X or whatever it is this week. So,
Yeah,
yeah. Yep.
get out of here.
Yeah. So, well, that's going to do it for this episode of the IDP After Show. Join me next time as I'm joined by Jason King, and we're going to talk about our favorite IDP prospects and our ideal landing spots for them ahead of the 2024 draft, which is just a few weeks away. So it's getting to be like that kid on Christmas time. So until then, you know what to do. Be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and hit that notification button so you never miss an episode of the IDP Show or the IDP After Show. For David, I'm Jeff, saying thank you for listening, and we'll catch you next time.
This was the IDP After Show.